Vincent Campbell, fiddler, is native to the Crows, na Cruacha, a deep valley in the heart of the Blue Stack Mountains in County Donegal. It's a remote place, and it has always had a life of its own, a life that grew out of the lives of the people, their beliefs and their customs, and never depended on world events. Those ways of life are now nearly extinct, the Crows nearly deserted. The few that remain here are an aging population. They were always a hardy people. Vincent Campbell recalls their history as they fade into a modern world.
Well, this is what I could never believe would happen in so short a time, that a place like this that was thriving so well in my young days, that it would come to an end so fast. I suppose you could say that it was a hard place to make a living when you would look around you here. But the people were well able to make a living here. They were hard-working people. These people that put so much effort into it, to make fields, build ditches, build houses at that time. Hard-working people like that that should be looked after and given something. Very little help would keep this place going, but it never seemed to have come at any stage. As far as we know, the first people that came here to this area, they were Mickaloons, and they came from Tyrone around the time of the planting of Ulster. There was nobody here before that, and all the Mickaloons had Irish at that time. And some of their relations in later years were still living in parts of Tyrone that used to come up to visit them, and they had Irish as well. And then that's how the people started to plant here. There came McHughes, and there came Quins, and there came Wards, and there came Givens. There was McGinleys, there was Chambers, there was Helfortys, there was Tummoneys, there was Conahans. Well, most of them lived. The old crowd stayed on until they died. Any of the young crowd that ever left Crows never came back because there was nothing to come back to. I was just thinking as I was passing here, looking at this house, there was a character lived here one time, and he was known as Brian Anna. And there was a story told that he was down in Glenties one day. He was fond of drink. So he met my grandfather, Charlie Hundivoe, and the two of them started drinking. So on in the day, they started running out of money. So they didn't know how they would get money, because you wouldn't get the loan of money them days, the same as you'd get today from everyone. So they told him that this man died sudden from this end of the glen. He was a very well-known figure in Glenties because he was a cartman at the time. So they said to themselves, this will be a good way of getting money. So every pub they went into, between the publicans and the ones that came in, they started giving them a shilling offerings. There was offerances on everybody nearly that time that died. So if you couldn't get to the wake or funeral, you sent the offerings on with somebody from the neighbourhood. So they started giving them the offerings, shilling offerings, to carry up to the family of the man that died. And they started drinking away. And by the end of the day, they had all the offerings drank. And they landed home with a fair drink on them. I don't know what happened to them when it was found out what they had done. But that's what they were, characters, and that's what they done. I remember people living in this house, and I remember the last of them, but they were very well known for curses. They had litanies of curses, and I don't know how they had all these litanies, big long litanies, and they never went to school because there was no school in these areas. So if you done something wrong on them, they would curse you with one of these litanies. They believed that that curse would fall on you and all that harvest times and things like that, so that you wouldn't get the harvest if you did something wrong on them. The same way, if it was the springtime, they would have a curse that your crops wouldn't grow. I never knew where they got all this, but I guarantee you they had as much as any priest nearly has today. Modern priest that would go on an altar to read mass. Oh yes, if they went out to curse you, I seen them myself. Some of them would go on their knees while they were cursing you. And then when they got up, they would wipe their shoes in the grass. People were afraid of them because they believed if there really was in the wrong that the curse would fall. They were really afraid of them. Well, I'm here now in the front of Minacahan School, and it's in a very remote part of this county. But when the house dancing stopped mostly or kind of died out in this part of the country, they started giving their local dances in the local schools. There wasn't that many dance halls built at the time, so the school was the nearest place. But one night, they had a dance in this school that we're at, and at that time it was local musicians, or maybe they would have a little bit to travel. And if they had a bit to travel, they would have a bicycle. So this night, particular night that they had a dance here, the two musicians had two bicycles. So on the way to the school, the bicycles got broke down. One of them got punctured, and I think, as far as I heard, the free wheel or something started giving trouble on the other one. So they never could reach the school. But the crowds gathered here, waiting on them, of course. And on about 10:30, they all started getting very confused about no music. And this fella, he was a lilter. He was James Tolan from Tieflaw. And your man that was sort of running the dance, he went to James and he asked him, could he do something for him for a while? Could he lilt until the musicians would come? So James says, certainly. So he started to lilt, and he lilted on until 12 o'clock, and no musicians landed. So James started to get dry. The crowd got big in a small place like this, and it was getting warm, and James decided that he wanted a drink of water. So a man went next door and he got a small pandy of water for him. But that didn't last long, of course, until James had the water drank and he was dry again. So this other man says that he would do a better job. He went next door and he got a big pandy. But these pandies used to hold about over a half a gallon, maybe some of them. So he told the other fellow to get a bucket, and he got the loan of a spoon himself, along with the pandy, and he went up, and he sat beside James, for he was lilting, and every time James would put out his tongue, when things were getting real hot for him, your man would throw a spoonful of water on his tongue. And that's how he kept the thing going, and that kept going until 7 o'clock in the morning. The musicians never came. So you can see for yourself how cheap it was to keep music and things going in them days, for it was wanted. I'll say it's a reel that was a fairly common reel in Donegal here, but the first time I learned the first part of it was a fiddle player from Mount Charles. He was known as John Cunningham, John the Blacksmith, as he was known locally. So I learned the second part of it of Johnny Doherty about a week after. But this tune is called The Silver Spire.
Well, this might be 80 or 90 years ago, long before I was born, but I heard it 1,000 times. It was very common to make poaching in those days, because the police were very severe on poaching making, and it was always made away on the cliffs. But there would have to be a stream there, because they wanted the water, you see. So these three men now had a run of poaching and making, and it was almost finished now, and they were very hungry. So two of them went off, and one of them was left to look after the remainder of the poaching that was, you know, coming out of the still. They weren't long away when he heard a piper in the distance. And he wasn't musical, not very musical anyway, but the piper was getting closer, gradually, to the little hut they had, you know, a little makeshift hut, till he was outside the door. And he played the one tune as long as that, even though he wasn't very musical, he picked up the tune. Whether it struck the man was or not, I don't know. Maybe he imagined it. But it was told time and again down the years that he did actually hear this tune being played, I don't know. So I can play the tune. So can James too. It's that little simple, you know. Would we play it? I'll play the tune.
I don't know it all.
I might get nervous. It's only a simple little tune, you know. Go on.
I don't know the time.
I know. We played it 150 times.
I didn't believe it.
I only hope the paper won't come on me the night time we're going home.
They never brought the light in until a few years ago, and there was nobody nearly left in Crows. That light should have been here 40 years ago, when there was people here. They never tarred the road down Crows until a few years ago as well. So that's why the Crows died out. It was a shame to my mind, and I'll never forgive them for that. Yes, it was here, at this house here, that the co-op was long ago kept by Biddy the cook. And Biddy herself never went to school much. So she had very little education, and she was very much stuck for somebody to do up books and that, because at that time people got the stuff for maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, and paid after selling a few sheep or a few cattle. So this man down the road, he had plenty of education. So he was slightly younger than Betty. So she didn't know how she could get in with him so that she could get him as a husband and have a cheap man to do up her books, because there wasn't that much money to pay these kind of clericals for office work. So anyhow, Betty let him run a bill so that after about 6 months or more, she got in with him better, and she started taking him in for tea. And I don't know, was it her put on the date with Johnny first, or was it Johnny put it on to her with her? But they started, as the day say today, what we say today is doing a line. So anyhow, the line was going on, and the next thing, Biddy started packing herself up on the front here. So make her look like a woman that was expecting. So Johnny had nothing to say, only that he had to marry her. And them days they never went to the chapel to get married together. The husband would go some other way to the chapel, a near cut. So Johnny took the hills here down to the chapel, and Betty went around the long road to the chapel on the horse and trap. She got the loan, by the way, of a hat of my grandmother, and she got herself dressed up for the occasion the best she could. So she was making sure, of course, that she would land in the chapel a while before Johnny, and so she did. And when she got off the trap, herself and the girl, she told the girl that she had to go around the back of the chapel for a while, and she told her to stand at the corner. So the girl did, and it was a breezy day. And the next thing the girl looked around, she seen these feathers going up in the air. So she wondered what was the cause of this, but said nothing. But he came back, and Johnny came in, and the man with him, and they got married. But little she thought that it was the pillow full of feathers that Biddy had here in the front to make Johnny think that he had her expecting, that she was getting rid of in the back of the chapel. So Johnny came home and Biddy, and they lived here in this co-op, and they never had any family, of course, because Biddy was a little bit past it, even at this stage. So Johnny kept the books while she done the housework and certain amount of looking after the co-op. And that's why that co-op survived for so long a years. She had nobody to pay to keep the books, so everything went well for a long, long time. Well, in Crows, in the old days, all the weddings and that was kept in the houses, as people know, and most places around this area. So these two were getting married. One of them was John McAloon, well known as John O'Shang. And the wife she was a ward, but she was well known as Anna John Hett. So the night they got married anyhow, or the day they got married, that night, actually, there was a house dance for them. So at the house dance for a wedding that time, it was always the custom that the bride and groom would be asked out to dance, some special dance during the night. So they were asked out to dance this dance, and it happened to be an old polky. And this old polky, there was never a name for it up till that. So after that, it was well known till this very day as John O'Shang agus Mean John Hett. But this is the polky. So Anna and John was called out to dance together. And that polky was ever after called as John O'Shang agus Mean John Hett. So that's one of the stories about this house. Sean O'Hoy spent a few years coming to this house. And no matter, he always claimed that she was like a spring well. Every time he came again, there was new stories, new old sayings coming to her head, and he kept taking them for years. He often told me himself that he might have never got the last of them, but he got the most of them. So she had terrible memory. She had no English whatsoever. She never went to school. But when the gramophone started, there was a record came out, and there was an English song on one of the records, My Lady Fair. And she used to sit down and listen to it, and she learned it. And a woman that had no English, only all Irish, she could sing My Lady Fair in English to everybody that came around. So that, I thought that was wonderful, you know.
Did you not hear my lady go down the garden singing? Blackbird and thrush were silent to hear the alleys ringing. Oh, saw you not my lady out in the garden there, shaming the rose and lily, for she is twice as fair.
All the families that I knew in my young days, there was a big population here, and a very lively place to come into was Crows. There was house dancing in every house several times a year. They had music, they had song, and they had all the traditions that Ireland could ever have. And still, the whole thing is wiped out and gone. I think it's the greatest sin of all time.